Every night, without exception, the Victorians went somewhere they could not explain. They closed their eyes in their gas-lit bedrooms, in their terraced houses and country estates and cramped urban lodgings, and they departed. They entered a country that was entirely familiar and entirely strange, a country made from the fragments of their waking lives, rearranged by forces they did not understand, populated by the dead and the living with equal ease, governed by no logic they could name upon waking. And unlike us, they did not shrug and reach for the coffee. They wrote it down, they consulted books, they visited doctors, mesmerists, clergymen, and professional dream interpreters. They argued in the pages of journals about whether the sleeping mind was a window onto the divine, a telegraph receiving transmissions from the spirit world, a symptom of physical illness, or the first intimation of a science not yet born. They took dreams, in other words, with enormous seriousness, and the beliefs they developed about what dreams were and what they meant were some of the strangest and most earnest the modern world has produced. Tonight, we will explore 10 quiet chapters on the Victorian understanding of dreams. We will begin with the landscape of the Victorian night itself, the bedroom, the habits of sleep, the darkness that descended before the electric light changed everything. We will visit the dream dictionaries that sat on Victorian bookshelves like household oracles, consulted in the morning over tea. We will follow the belief that dreams could predict the future, and the elaborate rituals people perform to summon prophetic visions. We will examine the Victorian terror of nightmares and the medical explanations that turn the nightmare into a diagnosis. We will enter the spiritualist seance room and ask what role the dream played in communication with the dead. We will meet the mesmerists and magnetic sleepers, who seem to demonstrate that the sleeping mind had powers the waking mind did not. We will look at how Victorian writers and artists used dreams, how the night fed the imagination of an entire culture. We will consider what the Victorians made of sleepwalking, that visible uncanny expression of the sleeping self. We will sit with the women who dream particularly and what the culture made of their dreams. And finally, we will arrive at the moment when a Viennese doctor named Freud began to read dreams differently and everything changed. Before we begin, if these slow journeys through the stranger corners of history bring you rest, I hope you will consider subscribing to the channel. And if the world of Victorian curiosity and cottagecore mysticism speaks to you, our curated collection of nature-inspired shirts is linked in the description below. Now settle in. The night is long. The dreamland is waiting. Let us go there together, carefully and quietly as the Victorians did, with a candle, a notebook, and the belief that what happens in the dark hours matters. Before we can understand what the Victorians believed about dreams, we need to understand where and how they slept. The Victorian bedroom was a different environment from ours in almost every respect. It was darker, profoundly, completely darker. Before the arrival of gas lighting in middle-class homes, and before the much later arrival of electric light, the night was genuinely dark in a way that is almost impossible to recreate in a modern city. A candle or an oil lamp provided light in the hours before sleep, but once it was extinguished, the bedroom became a darkness of a kind we rarely experience, total, enveloping, absolute. This darkness had its own relationship with sleep and dreaming. Sleep researchers now know that light suppresses melatonin, the hormone that signals the brain to prepare for sleep, and that darkness, real sustained darkness, shifts the body's rhythms in ways that modern lighting has largely disrupted. The Victorian sleeper, lying in complete darkness for 10 or 12 hours of a winter night, experienced a quality and quantity of sleep that was genuinely different from what most of us have today. They often slept in two segments, an early sleep followed by a waking period of an hour or two in the middle of the night, followed by a second sleep before dawn. This biphasic sleep pattern, which historians of sleep like Roger Kirch have documented extensively, meant that Victorians spent a significant amount of time in a state between sleeping and waking, in that hypnagogic border country where the images of sleep persist into waking consciousness. This waking period in the small hours was often used for prayer, for quiet reflection, and for attending to the dreams that had just occurred. The dream was still fresh, the bedroom was still dark. The mind was in that particular state of softened wakefulness that sits between the two sleeps, and in this state the dream could be turned over, examined, considered. It was not rushed away by the demands of the day. The Victorian bedroom itself was a heavily furnished space by modern standards. The bed was large and heavily draped, curtains hung from the canopy or from the bed frame on all sides, creating a smaller enclosed space within the room, a room within a room. These bed curtains served practical purposes. They kept in warmth, kept out draughts, and provided a degree of privacy in households where servants moved through the room. But they also created an atmosphere of enclosure and separation from the waking world that must have intensified the transition into sleep. To draw the bed curtains was to seal yourself into the dreaming world. The bedroom was also frequently shared, not just by couples, but in less wealthy households by children and sometimes by unrelated lodgers. Dreams dreamed in such proximity to others had a social dimension that solitary dreaming does not. A disturbed night might disturb others. A nightmare, with its cries and thrashings, was a public event. The shared bed created a collective relationship with the night that we have largely lost. Victorian medical writers paid considerable attention to the sleeping environment and its effects on dream quality. The position of the body during sleep was thought to influence the character of dreams. Sleeping on the back was widely believed to produce the heaviest and most disturbing dreams, including nightmares. Sleeping on the right side was considered most conducive to peaceful sleep. The direction in which the bed was oriented mattered, with some authorities recommending alignment with the Earth's magnetic field. The temperature and freshness of the air, the heaviness of the bedclothes, the hardness of the mattress, all of these were held to influence the quality of the night's visions. Diet was considered particularly significant. The connection between late eating and vivid or disturbing dreams was universally acknowledged in Victorian health literature, and specific foods were identified as dream promoters. Cheese was perennially accused. Rich meats, spiced dishes, alcohol, these were the known stimulants of what Victorian writers called the dream organ, that mysterious faculty of the sleeping mind that produced its nightly theatre. The concept of the dream organ is worth dwelling on for a moment because it reveals something essential about how educated Victorians thought about dreams. They did not yet have the framework of neuroscience that would have allowed them to think about brain processes, neurochemistry, or the cycling of sleep stages. Instead, they conceptualized the dreaming mind as a distinct faculty, almost a separate inner entity that came alive when the rational, waking mind withdrew. The dream organ was understood to be older than reason, less regulated, more susceptible to physical influence, but also capable of things that the waking mind could not accomplish, receiving divine messages, perceiving distant events, foreseeing the future. This dual understanding, the dream as both physical symptom and spiritual phenomenon, runs through virtually all Victorian dream literature. On one page, the medical writer will describe how a disordered stomach produces disordered dreams. On the next, they will describe authenticated cases of prophetic dreaming that seemed to transcend any physical explanation. The Victorians did not feel any particular need to resolve this tension. Their world was large enough to contain both the physiological and the supernatural, the digestive and the divine. The act of recording dreams, keeping a dream journal, was recommended by some Victorian authorities and practiced by many. Dream notebooks survive from the period in archives and private collections, and they offer extraordinary windows into Victorian interior life. The dreams recorded there are at once deeply familiar, anxious dreams about missed trains and lost objects and social embarrassment, the universal language of the sleeping mind, and deeply strange, populated by figures and fears and landscapes that belong specifically to the Victorian world. What strikes the reader of these notebooks is the seriousness with which the dreams were approached. They were not dismissed as mere sleep noise, as random firings of a tired brain. They were attended to, written down carefully, sometimes interpreted in marginal notes, sometimes returned to days later with additional observations. The dream was evidence of something. The question was only of what. Outside the window of that heavily curtained Victorian bedroom, the night was dark and long. The city, or the countryside, made its noises. The sleeper breathed, and the dream organ began its strange, insistent work. On the bookshelf of a typical Victorian middle-class household, alongside the Bible and the household management manual, and the collected poems of Tennyson, you might well have found a dream dictionary. These books were among the most widely printed and widely purchased popular publications of the 19th century. They went by various titles: The Interpreter of Dreams, The Complete Dream Book, Onero Critica Revised, The Language of Dreams, and they were compiled by authors who range from learned physicians citing classical sources to anonymous compilers who simply gathered existing superstitions and presented them between covers. They sold in their hundreds of thousands. They were consulted regularly, seriously, and with genuine expectation of guidance. The tradition they drew upon was ancient. The most famous classical dream interpretation text, the Onero Critica of Artemidorus of Daldis, written in the 2nd century CE, had never entirely gone out of use, and Victorian dream dictionaries frequently cited it or silently borrowed from it. Artemidorus had classified dreams into categories: those that predicted the future, those that represented the present state of the dreamer's body or mind, those that were mere reflections of waking concerns, and this classification, refined and elaborated through medieval and Renaissance transmission, provided the basic framework within which Victorian dream interpreters worked. The Victorian Dream Dictionary operated on the principle of symbolic correspondence. Every object, person, or event that appeared in a dream had a meaning, and that meaning was fixed, universal, and independent of the individual dreamer. To dream of teeth falling out meant impending financial loss, or the death of a family member, depending on which dictionary you consulted. To dream of water meant emotional turmoil. To dream of fish meant pregnancy or unexpected news. To dream of a snake might mean treachery from a trusted friend. To dream of flying meant either spiritual elevation or dangerous ambition. The range of symbols catalogued in these dictionaries was remarkable. Every animal, every object of domestic life, every weather condition, every activity, all had their assigned meanings. Dreaming of butter foretold prosperity, dreaming of salt foretold quarrels. Dreaming of candles signified either good news or death, depending on whether the candle was lit or extinguished. The colour of objects in dreams had significance. The direction of movement mattered. The time of year in which the dream occurred altered its interpretation. What is striking to the modern eye is how frequently the dictionaries contradict each other. The same symbol, an open door, a dark forest, a falling tooth, is assigned opposite meanings by different authorities with equal confidence. Dream of water and you will have smooth sailing. Dream of water and you face emotional catastrophe. This contradiction was not apparently a source of difficulty for Victorian readers who seem to have navigated the competing authorities the way we might navigate conflicting reviews of a restaurant, selecting the interpretation that seemed most plausible given their current circumstances. The social function of the Dream Dictionary was as much about reassurance and narrative as about prediction. A dream that had disturbed its dreamer could be opened to the dictionary and given a name, a meaning, a place in a comprehensible symbolic order, even a troubling meaning. The dream of teeth might mean financial difficulty was in some ways more bearable than meaninglessness. A bad dream with a bad meaning at least made sense. A bad dream that meant nothing at all left the dreamer alone with their anxiety. Some dream dictionaries were organized not by symbol but by outcome. You looked up the dream under the heading of what it portended rather than what you had dreamed. These were essentially books of fortune which used dreams as their input rather than tea leaves or playing cards. The assumption underlying them was that the dream world and the future were connected, that the sleeping mind had access to information that the waking mind did not, and that this information manifested in symbolic form that could be decoded. The class dimension of dream dictionary use is interesting. The more expensive leather-bound editions were marketed to middle and upper class readers and tended to include classical citations and medical framing. The cheaper penny editions, sold at market stalls and by street vendors, were aimed at working-class readers and tended to be blunter, more superstitious in tone, and more focused on practical predictions, marriage, money, death, that had immediate relevance to people with fewer resources for navigating uncertainty. Women were the primary market for most dream dictionaries, and the symbols catalogued in them reflected the preoccupations of Victorian femininity. Dreams of weddings and engagements, of children and pregnancy, of domestic events and family relationships. A young woman consulting her dream dictionary the morning after a vivid sleep was engaging in a practice that linked her to a long tradition of feminine dream interpretation. The woman, as the natural interpreter of dreams, the keeper of the household's symbolic life. Clergymen occasionally railed against the dream dictionaries from their pulpits on the grounds that they promoted superstition and displaced proper religious interpretation of dreams, the kind that looked to the Bible for precedent and to God for the sender. But the dictionaries survived clerical disapproval, as folk practices generally do, by being entirely compatible with religious belief in the minds of most of their users. To consult the Dream Dictionary was not, in the Victorian view, to reject the divine origin of dreams. It was simply to use the available tools to decode what God, or Providence, or the spirit world had sent. The last great Victorian Dream Dictionary, Edwin Raphael's The Book of Dreams and Ghosts, published in 1894, ran to multiple editions and sold across the English-speaking world. It is a compendious, occasionally eccentric volume that contains not just symbolic interpretations, but also authenticated case studies of prophetic dreams, ghost stories that occurred during sleep, and meditations on the nature of the soul during sleep. It sits squarely at the intersection of the folkloric, the scientific, and the supernatural, which is precisely where the Victorian understanding of dreams was most fully at home. On the morning after a disturbing night, the Victorian dreamer reached for their dictionary as naturally as they reached for the teapot. The dream had spoken. It remained only to understand what it had said. The Victorians believed, with considerable conviction and a significant body of anecdotal evidence, that dreams could tell you what was about to happen. This was not a fringe belief. It was held by educated people and uneducated people, by the religious and the secular, by doctors who wrote about the physiology of sleep, and by housemaids who consulted penny dream books. The idea that the sleeping mind had access to information unavailable to the waking mind, that the future or distant present events could be perceived in dreams, was simply part of the background furniture of Victorian consciousness. The evidence cited in its support was largely anecdotal, but it was abundant. Every family seemed to have its story. The aunt who dreamed of a ship sinking 3 nights before her nephew was lost at sea. The mother who dreamed of her soldier son, wounded on the same night he was shot in a battle on the other side of the world. The businessman who dreamed of a particular number and played it in a wager the following day. These stories circulated constantly in letters and diaries and dinner-table conversation, accumulating into a body of testimony that seemed, to those within the culture, to constitute genuine evidence. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, took the question of prophetic dreams seriously enough to conduct a systematic census. In their Census of Hallucinations, published in 1894, the Society collected thousands of accounts of apparently paranormal experiences, including a substantial category of dreams that seemed to have corresponded with real events. The researchers applied what statistical rigor they could to the material, attempting to distinguish coincidence from genuine anomaly. Their conclusion was cautious but not dismissive. The correspondence between certain dreams and subsequent or simultaneous events appeared, in some cases, to exceed what chance alone could explain. For most Victorians, no statistical analysis was required. The dream that came true was simply part of the fabric of experience, something that happened, something that had always happened, something that the Bible itself attested to in the stories of Joseph and Daniel and the prophets who received messages from God in sleep. The religious tradition and the popular tradition reinforced each other. Dreams were a channel through which the non-physical world communicated with the physical, and prophetic dreams were the clearest expression of this communication. Given this belief, it was natural that people would attempt to influence their dreams, to cultivate the conditions under which prophetic visions might come, and the Victorian era produced an extraordinarily rich repertoire of practices for doing exactly this. The most widespread of these practices was the Midsummer Dream Ritual, performed on specific nights of the year. Midsummer Eve, Halloween, St. Agnes Eve, when the boundary between the ordinary world and the spirit world was held to be thinnest, and when dreams dreamed on, these nights were believed to have particular prophetic force. John Keats' poem, The Eve of St. Agnes, written in 1819, but widely read and referenced throughout the Victorian period, describes a young woman performing the traditional ritual of St. Agnes Eve, fasting through the day, going to bed without supper, lying on her back without speaking, and fixing her mind on her future husband in the hope of seeing him in her dreams. St. Agnes Eve rituals were performed by young women across England and Scotland throughout the Victorian period, sometimes in groups, with the shared intensity of collective intention. The fast was important. An empty stomach, it was believed, produced clearer dreams. The silence was important. Speaking broke the spell. The supine position was important, even though it was also the position most associated with nightmares, because the prophetic dream of the husband required a kind of exposure, a vulnerability that side sleeping did not provide. Other dream summoning practices were more overtly magical in character. A piece of wedding cake placed under the pillow was thought to produce dreams of one's future spouse. A bay leaf carried on the person through the day, and then placed beneath the pillow at night, was said to promote prophetic dreams. Certain herbs, Mugwort in particular, a plant with a long association with dreaming and divination across many cultures, were burned or placed beneath the pillow to encourage vivid and meaningful visions. Mugwort's association with dreams is ancient. It was used by Anglo-Saxon healers and is referenced in medieval herbals, but it experienced a Victorian revival in the context of the broader interest in folk magic and herbalism that characterised the period. The naturalist and folklorist Maud Grieve, whose Modern Herbal was published in 1931 but drew extensively on Victorian practice, notes that mugwort pillows were still being used to promote dreaming at the time of her writing. The practice of sleeping on a specific question, going to sleep with a problem or uncertainty in mind in the deliberate hope of receiving an answer in dreams, was also widely practiced and written about. This was understood as a more accessible form of the prophetic dream. Rather than waiting passively for the future to announce itself, the dreamer actively posed a question to the dreaming mind, using the period before sleep to saturate their consciousness with the question, then trusting the night to provide an answer. Victorian medical writers were divided about this practice. Some endorsed it, arguing that the sleeping mind, freed from the distractions of waking life, could work through problems with greater clarity and produce genuine solutions. Others warned against it, arguing that deliberately agitating the mind before sleep was likely to produce disturbed rather than prophetic dreams, and that the habit of seeking guidance in dreams undermined the rational faculties by training the mind to defer to the irrational. The most celebrated Victorian case of a prophetic dream, celebrated enough to have been widely reprinted and discussed in the periodical press, is the dream of John Williams in 1812. Williams, a Cornish mine manager, dreamed on 3 consecutive nights that he witnessed the assassination of a man in the lobby of the House of Commons. The dream was so vivid, so specific, and so persistent that he consulted friends about whether to report it. He did not. Within days, the Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, was shot and killed in the lobby of the House of Commons. The dream had described the assassin's clothing, the location, the manner of the act. This case was cited throughout the Victorian period as among the best authenticated examples of prophetic dreaming on record. It was included in virtually every Victorian book on dreams and the supernatural. It was used as evidence by spiritualists, by religious writers, and by early psychical researchers, each group reading it through their own interpretive framework, but all agreeing that it represented something that demanded serious attention. Whether or not you believe that the future can be seen in dreams, the Victorian investment in that belief is historically significant. It tells us something about a culture in which uncertainty was profound, in which illness came quickly and medicine could do little, in which financial catastrophe could arrive without warning, in which the people you loved could be taken very suddenly, and in which the dream, that nightly arrival from beyond the rational world, offered the consolation of possible foreknowledge. If you could know what was coming, you were not entirely helpless before it. The prophetic dream was, in the end, a form of hope. The word nightmare does not originally mean a bad dream. It means specifically a female spirit, a mare, that sits on the chest of the sleeper in the night, pressing down with suffocating weight, inducing a paralysis that the sleeper cannot break, and a terror that seems to be not dream, but reality. The mare was a creature of folk belief across northern Europe, known by different names in different regions: the German Alp, the Scandinavian Mara, the Slavic Mora, the Scottish and Irish hag, but consistent in her essential character. She came in the night, she sat on the body, she could not be moved, and her visitations were experienced with a vividness and a physical reality that distinguished them sharply from ordinary dreaming. What the mare belief was describing in the language of pre-scientific folk experience is what we now call sleep paralysis, the neurological state in which the body's motor systems remain in the inhibitory mode of REM sleep while the mind achieves a degree of wakefulness, leaving the sleeper conscious but completely unable to move and typically experiencing vivid, frightening hallucinations of a presence in the room or a weight on the chest. Sleep paralysis is common, experienced at least once by a significant proportion of the population, and the terror it produces, combined with its physical reality and its consistent phenomenology, has generated the mare belief independently in dozens of cultures around the world. The Victorians inherited both the folk belief in the mare and a set of medical explanations for nightmare that had been developing since the 18th century. The dominant medical account, established by the Edinburgh physician John Bond in his essay on the incubus, or nightmare of 1753, and elaborated by subsequent writers, understood the nightmare as a product of physical causes: impaired circulation, digestive disorder, pressure on the lungs, disordered nervous function. The weight on the chest was real. It was the weight of the body's own disordered physiology, translated into the symbolic language of dream. Victorian medical writers compiled extensive lists of the physical conditions that predisposed to nightmare. Overeating was primary among them, particularly rich or spiced food consumed close to sleep. Heart disease, respiratory conditions, and disorders of the liver were all held to produce characteristic nightmare patterns. The sleeping position mattered enormously. The supine position, with the sleeper lying flat on their back, was considered almost certain to produce nightmares in susceptible individuals because it restricted the expansion of the lungs and allowed the digestive organs to press upon the diaphragm. The remedy, accordingly, was physical. Change the diet. Change the sleeping position. Some Victorian physicians prescribed sleeping with the right arm raised on a pillow to prevent rolling onto the back. Ensure adequate ventilation of the sleeping room. Avoid alcohol and stimulants. Take exercise during the day. Attend to the health of the liver. These were not supernatural prescriptions. They were the sensible medical hygiene of a rational age, and they sat alongside the old folk remedies without any obvious sense of contradiction. The folk remedies for nightmare were elaborate and ancient. Iron was protective. A horseshoe hung above the bed, or a piece of iron placed beneath the pillow, would deter the mare. The Lord's Prayer said backwards was a charm against her visits. A knife placed under the pillow would drive her away, as would a pair of shoes left with the toes pointing outward from the bed, the direction of departure, symbolically compelling the mare to leave by the way she had come. Salt was protective, as it was against most malevolent supernatural forces. A sprig of rowan, or of St. John's wort, placed near the sleeping body would keep her at a distance. These remedies were practiced throughout the Victorian period in rural areas, alongside and sometimes in combination with the medical prescriptions. The Victorian countryside retained a deeply layered relationship with supernatural belief that coexisted, sometimes uneasily, with the rationalism and religious orthodoxy of the educated middle class. A farm wife who prescribed iron under the pillow and digestive bitters at bedtime was not being inconsistent. She was simply covering all possible causes. The experience of the nightmare in Victorian literature is rich and carefully observed. Charles Dickens, whose own sleep was frequently disturbed and who wrote extensively about dreams in his fiction and correspondence, described nightmares with particular vividness. The peculiar logic of the dream state, the way fear in nightmares had a quality distinct from waking fear, more absolute, more suffocating, more inescapable. Scrooge's visits from the three spirits in A Christmas Carol are dreamlike in precisely this way. The spirits have the quality of nightmare presences, simultaneously helpful and terrifying, impossible to dismiss or flee. The visual culture of the Victorian nightmare is dominated by a single image. Henry Fuseli's painting, The Nightmare, first exhibited in 1781 and reproduced, copied and referenced throughout the 19th century. It shows a woman lying on her back in abandoned sleep, her arms hanging down, her face tilted toward the viewer. On her chest sits a small, dark, grinning demon, the incubus or nightmare creature, making his crushing weight felt. Behind the curtain at the back of the painting, a horse's head emerges, wild-eyed, the nightmare in its other form, the animal whose name has become attached to the experience. Fuseli painted the scene from his own nightmare experiences. He was known to eat raw beef before sleep in order to stimulate particularly vivid dreams, a practice that both fascinated and horrified his contemporaries. The painting captured something precise about the phenomenology of sleep paralysis. The crushing weight, the hideous presence, the helplessness of the body that cannot move. It became one of the most reproduced images of the century, not because it was shocking, though it was, but because it was recognized. People knew what Fuseli had painted, because they had been there. The gendering of the nightmare is worth noting. The mare herself was female. The victim in Fuseli's most famous version is female. Victorian medical literature paid particular attention to nightmares in women, associating them with hysteria, with the disorders of the uterus, with the particular vulnerabilities of the female constitution. We will return to the relationship between Victorian women and their dreams in a later chapter. But the nightmare, that most visceral and bodily of dream experiences, was coded female in a way that shaped how it was understood, treated, and feared. What the nightmare offered, in the end, was a direct confrontation with the body's vulnerability in sleep. The dreamer was helpless. Something had come in the night. Something had sat on the chest and would not move. Whatever the medical explanation, whatever the folk remedy, whatever the rational reassurance of the morning, the nightmare had demonstrated with complete and terrifying clarity that the night was not entirely safe. In 1848, the year the Fox sisters first claimed to communicate with the dead through rappings in a Hydesville farmhouse, a new relationship between the living and the dead began to take shape in the English-speaking world. Spiritualism, the belief that the dead persisted as conscious entities in a spirit realm and could communicate with the living through specially sensitive individuals called mediums, spread with remarkable speed through Victorian society, acquiring millions of adherents within a generation. It offered, in an era of high mortality, of epidemics and industrial accidents and infant death, something that mainstream Christianity sometimes struggled to provide: immediate, personal, verifiable contact with the specific dead, not the abstract promise of resurrection at the last day, but the voice of your mother speaking to you now through the hands of the medium. And dreams, from the very beginning of the spiritualist movement, were understood as one of the primary channels through which the dead communicated with the living. The reasoning was intuitive and widely accepted. In sleep, the waking mind was quieted. The rational barriers that ordinarily prevented the perception of spiritual reality were lowered. The soul, partially freed from its bodily constraints, was more receptive to the vibrations of the spirit world. This was not a new idea. It had ancient precedents in both classical philosophy and religious tradition, but spiritualism gave it a new specificity and urgency. The dead did not merely appear in dreams as symbols or memories. They visited, they delivered messages, they comforted, warned, and sometimes alarmed the people who had loved them. Victorian spiritualist literature is full of accounts of visitation dreams, dreams in which a deceased person appeared with unmistakable reality and delivered specific, verifiable information. The quality attributed to these dreams in the accounts is consistent and distinctive. They were experienced as categorically different from ordinary dreams, more vivid, more emotionally intense, possessed of a clarity and presence that ordinary dreaming lacked. The dead person was not a dream image made from memory. They were present, in some sense that the dreamer felt unable to articulate but was certain of. The periodical journal of the Society for Psychical Research contains hundreds of such accounts, carefully collected and where possible corroborated. Edmund Gurney, Frederick Myers, and Frank Podmore, in their landmark compilation, Phantasms of the Living, published in 1886, documented dozens of cases in which a dreamer reported an apparition or vivid dream of a living person who was, at the time of the dream, undergoing a crisis, death, serious injury, or intense emotional distress. Their statistical analysis suggested that such dreams occurred more frequently than chance would predict, though the methodology has been debated by subsequent scholars. The sleeping medium occupied a special place in spiritualist practice. Many of the most celebrated Victorian mediums performed their most impressive work in trance states that bore a close resemblance to sleep. The medium would enter a state of apparent unconsciousness, eyes closed, body slack, unresponsive to ordinary stimulation, and from this state produce speech, automatic writing, or physical phenomena attributed to spirit control. The boundary between the mediumistic trance and the prophetic dream was blurred in contemporary accounts. Both were understood as states in which the conscious self was set aside and something else, the spirit world, was permitted to speak. Some mediums reported that their trance communications came to them in dreamlike imagery that they then translated into words for their sitters. The spirit world, in this account, communicated in the same symbolic, non-literal language as the ordinary dream, a language of images and impressions and emotional tones that required interpretation rather than direct transcription. The medium was, in this sense, a professional dream interpreter, someone with special sensitivity to the symbolic communications of the non-physical world. The question of grief and the visitation dream is one of the most humanly significant aspects of Victorian dream belief. The Victorians were, by modern standards, surrounded by death. Infant mortality was high. Epidemics could move through a family quickly. Industrial and agricultural accidents were common. Men died in wars and in the service of empire on the other side of the world. The grief that resulted was enormous in scale and shaped a culture in profound ways. The elaborate mourning customs, the keeping of hair and photographs, the memorial jewellery made from the hair of the dead. In this context, the dream in which the dead returned was not merely an interesting psychic phenomenon. It was a lifeline. The mother who had lost a child and dreamed of that child speaking to her, apparently well and happy in some other place, received something that no amount of rational reassurance could quite provide. The dream visit was direct evidence for those who received it that love persisted beyond death, that the person who had gone was not annihilated but merely relocated, and that the connection between them remained intact. Queen Victoria herself, whose grief at the death of Prince Albert in 1861 shaped the remaining 40 years of her reign, reportedly consulted mediums and attended séances in the years following his death. Whether she specifically sought Albert in dreams is not recorded in the official sources, but her documented interest in spiritualism suggests that she was not immune to the hope that the dead could be reached through the altered states of consciousness that sleep and trance provided. The spiritualist dream was, in the end, both a belief and a comfort, a way of inhabiting the unacceptable fact of death with something that felt like ongoing relationship. The dead came back, in the quiet of the Victorian night, to the people who missed them, and the people who received these visits, as a rule, did not question them. They simply gratefully received. In 1784, a royal commission appointed by Louis XVI of France examined the claims of Franz Anton Mesmer, the Viennese physician who had arrived in Paris and created an extraordinary sensation with his theory of animal magnetism. Mesmer believed that a subtle invisible fluid permeated the universe and all living things, and that disease arose from the disruption of this fluid's natural flow through the body. Health could be restored by a trained practitioner who directed the fluid through touch, through the use of magnetized objects, through the power of will, to rebalance the patient's system. In Mesmer's famous bouquet sessions, patients sat around a large tub filled with magnetized water and iron filings, holding iron rods that projected from the tub, and waited for the crisis, a convulsive episode that would signal the restoration of their magnetic harmony. The Royal Commission, which included Benjamin Franklin and the chemist Lavoisier among its members, concluded that the magnetic fluid did not exist and that the effects Mesmer produced were attributable to imagination and imitation. Mesmer's reputation was damaged, but the practice he had initiated, the induction of trance states in patients through sustained attention and suggestion, continued to develop under the name of mesmerism, and, by the mid-Victorian period, had become one of the most significant and most controversial topics in medical and popular culture. What mesmerism had discovered, in effect, was hypnosis, though that word would not be coined until 1843, when the Scottish surgeon James Braid introduced it in an attempt to place the phenomenon on a more scientific footing. The mesmeric trance was a state of altered consciousness, induced by a fixed gaze, repetitive passes of the hands, and focused verbal suggestion. In this state, subjects showed remarkable properties. They were insensible to pain, they were highly responsive to suggestion, and they sometimes demonstrated what appeared to be enhanced perceptual abilities, the ability to diagnose illness by touch, to perceive distant events, to read sealed letters. The mesmeric trance was explicitly compared to sleep from the very beginning. It was called magnetic sleep, somnambulism, or artificial somnambulism, terms that linked it directly to the natural altered states of the sleeping mind. And just as natural sleep was believed to give the dreaming mind access to information unavailable in waking life, the magnetic sleep was believed to extend these powers further. The mesmeric subject was understood to be in a state analogous to dreaming, but more controlled, more directed, more amenable to investigation. The magnetic sleeper, or somnambule, was typically a woman, a detail that we will return to in the context of Victorian beliefs about female dreamers. She was placed in trance by the mesmerist and then questioned, or she was directed to perform diagnoses and clairvoyant readings while in the trance state. The accounts of what these subjects produced in trance are extraordinary. Precise medical diagnoses of people they had never met, descriptions of distant scenes, responses to unspoken questions, apparent communications from the dead. The Victorian medical establishment was deeply divided about mesmerism. Some physicians, particularly those working in pain management and surgery before the widespread adoption of chemical anesthesia, found it practically useful and argued for its acceptance on purely empirical grounds. Whatever the explanation, patients who were mesmerized did not feel the surgeon's knife. Others argued that the entire phenomenon was a product of fraud and suggestion, that the apparently enhanced abilities of mesmeric subjects were either faked or the result of hyperacute normal sensory processing, rather than any paranormal faculty. The Society for Psychical Research took a particular interest in the relationship between the mesmeric state and apparently paranormal cognition, conducting careful experiments with mesmeric subjects and documenting cases of what they called thought transference, the apparent transmission of mental content from one mind to another, that seemed particularly robust in mesmeric conditions. Their hypothesis was that the mesmeric trance, like natural sleep, reduced the normal barriers between individual minds, allowing the direct perception of another person's thoughts or the reception of information from distant sources. For popular Victorian culture, mesmerism was less a scientific question than a theatrical spectacle and a parlour entertainment. Stage mesmerists toured the country, demonstrating the powers of the trance before paying audiences. Mesmerized subjects were made to experience hallucinations, to perform feats apparently beyond their normal abilities, to forget their names or believe they were someone else entirely. The entertainment value was high, but so was the unease. The mesmeric subject, apparently stripped of their will and placed entirely under the control of the mesmerist, embodied anxieties about autonomy, consciousness, and the stability of the self that ran deep in Victorian culture. The relationship between mesmerism and dreams was not merely analogical. Mesmeric subjects frequently described their experiences in trance as dreamlike. They entered a darkness, they felt the ordinary world withdraw, they found themselves in another space entirely, sometimes a space that felt more real than waking reality, sometimes a space of pure symbolic imagery, sometimes a space in which the dead were present and communicative. The language they used to describe these experiences drew directly on the vocabulary of dreaming, suggesting that the two states, the natural and the induced, were understood to share an underlying nature. What mesmerism demonstrated at its most intellectually productive was that the sleeping, dreaming mind was not merely passive, not just a receiver of random images generated by digestive or circulatory disorder. It was active, directed, powerful in ways that waking consciousness could not easily match. The mesmeric subject's enhanced abilities suggested that beneath the ordinary waking mind, there was another mind or another layer of mind that was ordinarily inaccessible but could be reached in the right conditions. This suggestion, which Frederick Myers would develop into his theory of the subliminal self, and which would eventually become, in Freud's hands, the concept of the unconscious, was perhaps the most significant intellectual legacy of the Victorian engagement with dreams and trance. The Victorian mesmerist, with his fixed gaze and his repetitive passes of the hands, was doing something stranger and more consequential than he knew. He was gesturing toward the great hidden interior of the human mind, the part that speaks in the language of dreams, that knows things the waking self does not, that comes alive in the dark and falls silent in the light. The Victorian era was one of the most productive periods in the history of literature, and a significant portion of what it produced came from dreams. Not metaphorically, literally, Victorian writers dreamed their plots, their characters, their images, their most famous scenes, with a frequency and a specificity that makes the dream one of the essential sources of Victorian literary culture. They also wrote about dreams with unusual intensity, using the space of the dream as a setting in which the novel's real emotional and psychological content could be explored with a freedom that the conventions of realistic fiction did not otherwise permit. The most celebrated literary dream of the period is probably Robert Louis Stevenson's account of The Origin of Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886, Stevenson claimed that the essential scenario of the story, the respectable man who transforms into a creature of pure appetite and violence, came to him in a dream. He had been struggling, he wrote, to find a story that would convey his long-held interest in the dual nature of the human personality, its respectable surface, and its dark interior. The dream gave him the transformation scene. He woke up, according to his own account, angry that his wife had interrupted the dream before it was finished, and immediately began to write. The story that emerged from that dream became one of the defining texts of the period. So precisely did it articulate something that Victorian culture was thinking but had not quite said. The dream did not merely suggest a plot device. It delivered, in one vivid scenario, the complete symbolic structure of the anxiety it addressed, the hidden self, the nightly transformation, the face that appears in the mirror and is not quite your own. Charlotte Bronte, who dreamed vividly and whose dreams appear with thinly disguised frequency in her novels and letters, described the process of writing as deeply connected to the dream state, a giving over of the waking, controlling self to something else, something that knew more than she did about the story she was trying to tell. Her letters describe scenes that came to her unsought, characters who seemed to speak without her direction, narratives that developed with a logic she did not consciously impose. This is the creative process as the Victorians often understood it, not the exercise of rational will, but the receptive opening of the self to something that came from below the level of ordinary consciousness. The pre-Raphaelite painters, whose work defined a significant strand of Victorian visual culture, were deeply interested in dream imagery, and several of them were explicit about the dream origins of specific works. Dante Gabriel Rossetti's painting, Beata Beatrix, his memorial to his dead wife Elizabeth Siddal, has the quality of a dream image, suspended, timeless, lit by a light that comes from no identifiable source. Edward Burne-Jones's paintings of sleeping figures, of enchanted castles and waiting maidens, drew on the visual logic of the dream directly, images in which time has stopped, in which the ordinary laws of cause and effect are suspended, in which beauty has been preserved by a kind of magical freezing. The dream in Victorian fiction served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was a narrative convenience, a space in which information could be conveyed to characters and to readers that the realistic plot could not easily provide. It was a psychological space, a place where the characters' true emotional state could be shown, independent of their controlled social presentation. And it was a philosophical or spiritual space, a place where the novel could address questions about death, fate, and the nature of reality that the realistic surface of the narrative could not directly approach. Wilkie Collins, whose sensation novels depend heavily on states of altered consciousness, drugged sleep, sleepwalking, nervous collapse, used the dream as a structural device with great sophistication. In The Moonstone, the central mystery turns on an act performed in opium-induced sleep, and the novel's investigation of that act becomes an exploration of the boundaries between waking and sleeping consciousness, between intention and compulsion, between the self we know and the self that acts without our knowledge. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, first published in 1821 but widely read throughout the Victorian period, contains some of the most remarkable descriptions of drug-induced dreaming in the English language. De Quincey described the opium dream as an amplification and distortion of the ordinary dream, the same basic mechanism, but operating at a far greater intensity, producing visions of extraordinary vividness and architectural complexity. The opium dream was also temporal in a way that ordinary dreams were not. It seemed to De Quincey to fold time, to bring the distant past into immediate presence, to make the personal and the historical simultaneous. The relationship between opium and the Victorian dream is complex. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, was widely available and widely used throughout the period, as a medicine, as a sedative for restless children, as a remedy for menstrual pain and anxiety and insomnia. Its use was not stigmatized in the way that later drug use would be, and its effects on dreaming, the vivid architectural, emotionally intense dreams it produced, were part of the cultural background of the period. Many Victorian writers were using laudanum regularly, and many of the dreams they described in their fiction and poetry bear the distinctive quality of the opiate dream. Tennyson's poem The Lotus Eaters, Coleridge's Kubla Khan, strictly pre-Victorian but canonical throughout the period, the dream passages in De Quincey, these are the high literary expressions of a relationship between altered states, dreams, and the imagination that was more broadly present in the culture. The Victorian imagination was, in part, a dreaming imagination, one that valued the images that came from below the level of rational control, that sought in the nightly visions of sleep the material that conscious craft could not provide. There is something both wonderful and humbling in the knowledge that strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde came from a dream, that one of the period's most enduring and resonant works of fiction, one that gave the culture a permanent symbolic vocabulary for thinking about the divided self, arrived in the night, unbidden, already formed. The dream did not merely inspire the book. In some important sense, the dream wrote the book, and Stevenson's waking self had only to copy it down. The sleepwalker presented the Victorians with a particular kind of philosophical problem. Here was a person who was, by every physiological measure, asleep, eyes unseeing, mind absent, responsive to none of the ordinary demands of social life, and yet moving through the world with apparent purposefulness, navigating obstacles, climbing stairs, sometimes performing complex tasks, sometimes speaking in coherent sentences. The sleepwalker was neither fully asleep nor fully awake. They occupied a state between the two that seemed to challenge the most basic assumptions about what it meant to be a conscious, intentional being. Victorian medical writers categorized sleepwalking, which they called somnambulism, alongside the mesmeric trance and the spiritualist trance, as one of a family of altered states in which the ordinary relationship between mind and body was disrupted. In all three states, the conscious waking self was apparently absent or suspended, and yet the body continued to act, directed by something else, something that knew the layout of the house, that could find its way to specific places, that seemed to have intentions even in the absence of ordinary consciousness. The leading Victorian medical authority on sleepwalking was probably the physician Robert McNish, whose Philosophy of Sleep, first published in 1830 and reprinted multiple times through the Victorian period, contained detailed case studies and theoretical analysis of somnambulism, alongside discussions of dreams, nightmares, trance, and other states of altered consciousness. McNish's account was comprehensive and relatively systematic, drawing on the available medical literature and on cases he had personally investigated. What McNish found in the case studies was consistent and extraordinary. Sleepwalkers performed acts during their nocturnal excursions that they were incapable of performing while awake. They climbed precipitous rooftops without vertigo. They walked along narrow ledges with perfect balance. They composed music, wrote letters, solved mathematical problems. They navigated complex environments in complete darkness, apparently guided by a spatial sense that did not depend on visual input. And they remembered nothing of this upon waking. The memory gap was one of the most philosophically troubling aspects of somnambulism. If the sleepwalker had no memory of what they had done, in what sense were they the person who had done it? The question of personal identity, of what made a self continuous and responsible across time, was one of the central preoccupations of Victorian philosophy, and the sleepwalker posed it in unusually sharp form. If I do something in my sleep that I am not conscious of and do not remember, am I responsible for it? Is it my action at all? The legal implications were occasionally acute. There were Victorian court cases in which somnambulism was raised as a defence against charges of criminal acts alleged to have been committed during sleep. The medical establishment was divided on the question of whether a genuine somnambulist could be held responsible for their nocturnal actions, and the courts dealt with these cases with varying degrees of sympathy and scepticism. The figure of the sleepwalker in Victorian fiction is a rich and persistent one. Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone, again, features sleepwalking as a central mechanism. The mystery of who took the diamond resolves into the revelation that the protagonist did it in his sleep, under the influence of laudanum, without any waking consciousness of the act. The sleepwalker, in Collins' hands, becomes a figure for the acting self that bypasses the knowing self, the part of us that does things our consciousness does not sanction or even acknowledge. The sleepwalking scene in Shakespeare's Macbeth, Lady Macbeth moving through the castle in her sleep, compulsively washing invisible blood from her hands, was one of the most frequently discussed and performed scenes in Victorian theatre. Victorian audiences and critics read it through the lens of their own rich understanding of somnambulism. The scene was psychologically precise, they felt, in showing how guilt and suppressed knowledge could erupt into consciousness through the medium of sleep when the waking defences were down. Some Victorian accounts of sleepwalking had a distinctly spiritual dimension. Somnambulists were sometimes reported to visit people who were dying or in distress, to appear at the bedside of a sick relative in another house, apparently guided there by some perception unavailable to the waking mind. These accounts were treated as evidence for the same underlying principle that prophetic dreams supported, that in the altered states of sleep, the self was not bounded by the physical limits of the body and could perceive or travel beyond them. The treatment of somnambulism in Victorian medicine was largely preventive. The sleeping environment should be made safe, windows fastened, stairs blocked, sharp objects removed, the underlying constitutional weaknesses that predispose to somnambulism, nervous exhaustion, digestive disorder, excessive mental work, should be addressed. Some physicians recommended the use of cold water, a wet towel placed on the forehead, or a cold bath maintained near the bed to startle the sleepwalker awake if they were observed to begin walking. The principle was that any sudden sensory shock would trigger the return of waking consciousness. What the sleepwalker ultimately represented in the Victorian imagination was the self-divided, the same problem that Jekyll and Hyde addressed, the same problem that mesmerism demonstrated, the same problem that the dream diary revealed. There was more to the self than the waking mind. There was a part that acted while the known self slept, that knew things the known self did not, that moved through the world according to imperatives the waking person could not account for. The sleepwalker made this visible literally in the dark of the night, and the sight of it was, for the Victorians, both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Victorian culture had a particular theory about women and dreams. It held, with considerable confidence and the apparent support of both medical authority and cultural tradition, that women were more sensitive to the dream world than men, more receptive to its communications, more prone to its disturbances, more likely to experience its most intense forms. The female constitution, in the dominant medical view of the period, was characterized by a heightened nervous sensitivity that made women simultaneously more vulnerable to disorder and more open to perceptions that the coarser male nervous system could not access. This dual characterization, the sensitive woman as both fragile and visionary, shaped the entire Victorian discourse around women and dreams. On one side, women were the primary sufferers of the nightmare and of the related condition of hysteria, whose symptoms overlapped extensively with the most disturbing dream experiences: paralysis, hallucination, the sense of a presence in the room, uncontrollable bodily movements. On the other side, women were the natural mediums, the natural visionaries, the natural receivers of prophetic and spiritual communications in sleep. The medical category of hysteria, which the Victorian period inherited from earlier centuries and elaborated with considerable energy, was understood as primarily a disorder of the female reproductive system, specifically of the uterus, whose Greek name, hystera, gave the condition its name. The symptoms of hysteria were various and somewhat fluid, but they consistently included disturbances of sleep, vivid and disturbing dreams, somnambulism, the apparently spontaneous trance states that resembled both sleep and the mesmeric trance. The hysterical woman was, among other things, a woman whose dream life had escaped its proper boundaries and was intruding on her waking life. The treatment of hysterical women who reported disturbing dreams or dreamlike waking states was typically oriented toward rest and quiet. The rest cure that the American physician Silas Weir Mitchell made famous in the 1870s involved extended bed rest, isolation from mental stimulation, and a diet designed to rebuild what Mitchell characterized as depleted nervous energy. The logic was that the female nervous system, overstimulated by the demands of modern life, had collapsed into a state in which the ordinary boundaries between sleep and waking, between the dream and the real, had become permeable. But the same nervous sensitivity that made women susceptible to hysteria also, in the Victorian view, made them natural mediums. The majority of the most celebrated Victorian mediums were women: Kate and Maggie Fox, Florence Cook, Eusapia Palladino, and the theoretical framework of spiritualism held that the female constitution was more suited to mediumship because it was more passive, more receptive, less defended by the kind of rational skepticism that impeded the male nervous system's contact with the spirit world. The sleeping female medium was a figure of considerable cultural power in Victorian Britain. She lay in trance, apparently unconscious, her body given over to forces beyond her control, producing communications that her waking self could not account for. The figure combined the helplessness of the nightmare sufferer, the woman pinned beneath the incubus, unable to move or cry out, with the visionary authority of the prophetess. She was simultaneously victim and oracle. Women's own accounts of their dream lives, where they survive in diaries and letters, complicate the medical and spiritualist narratives considerably. Many Victorian women wrote about their dreams with great intelligence and self-awareness, treating them not as symptoms of nervous disorder or as supernatural communications, but as a rich interior landscape to be explored and understood. The dream diary was a particularly female form. It gave women a space in which to record and reflect on their inner lives in a period when the public expression of that inner life was severely constrained. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, whose letters and poems contain extensive dream references, wrote about her dreams with the seriousness of someone who understood them as a significant form of experience, connected to but not reducible to her waking life. Her long poem, Aurora Lee, published in 1856, is itself dreamlike in its structure. Associative, visionary, moving through time and space with the logic of the dreaming mind rather than the logic of the realistic novel. George Eliot, whose psychological realism is one of the great achievements of Victorian fiction, used dreams in her novels as windows into the emotional depths of her characters, particularly her female characters. The dreams in Middlemarch and in Daniel Deronda are not supernatural or prophetic. They are psychological, revealing the fears and desires and unacknowledged truths that the character's waking self cannot directly confront. Eliot's treatment of dreams is the most modern in the Victorian canon, closest to the Freudian reading that was still several decades away. The question of what Victorian women actually believed about their dreams, rather than what the medical and spiritual authorities told them to believe, is difficult to recover from the historical record, but what survives in the diaries and letters and poems and novels written by women suggests a relationship with the dream that was more complex, more personal, and more varied than either the hysterical patient or the passive medium could accommodate. Women dreamed their grief and their desire and their ambition and their fear. They recorded their dreams with care. They returned to them and thought about them. They found in the dream a space that was, in the truest sense, their own. The feminine dream, in the end, was not simply a symptom or a supernatural gift. It was a form of inner life, insistent, rich, not entirely governable, and belonging to no one else. In 1899, though the publisher dated it 1900, perhaps to give it the appearance of belonging to the new century, a book was published in Vienna that changed the way the Western world understood dreams. Die Traumdeutung, the interpretation of dreams, was written by a Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud, and it sold poorly at first. The initial print run of 600 copies took 8 years to sell out, but the ideas it contained were so different from everything that had come before, and so precisely timed to catch the intellectual currents of its moment, that within a generation it had become one of the most discussed books of the 20th century. To understand what Freud changed, we need to understand what he was changing from. He was changing from an intellectual world that we have spent the last 9 chapters exploring, a world in which dreams were simultaneously medical symptoms and spiritual communications, in which they could predict the future and speak for the dead, in which the sleeping mind was understood as a distinct entity that came alive in the darkness with powers and perceptions denied to the waking self. Freud kept some of this and discarded most of it. What he kept was the essential insight that the dream was meaningful, that it was not mere physiological noise, not the random firing of a tired brain, not simply the rerunning of the day's events in a disorganized form. The dream said something. It communicated something, and that something was worth taking seriously. What he discarded was the external source. For Freud, the dream did not communicate from outside the dreamer, not from God, not from the spirit world, not from the collective symbolism of the dream dictionary. It communicated from inside the dreamer, from the unconscious, that vast unlit territory of suppressed memories, unfulfilled wishes, unacknowledged fears, and unresolved conflicts that lay beneath the surface of the conscious self. The dream, in Freud's account, was the royal road to the unconscious, the place where the censorship that the waking mind exercised over its own contents was relaxed, where forbidden wishes could be expressed in disguised form, where the true emotional life of the person could be glimpsed through the symbolic distortions of the dream work. The analyst, who could decode the dream, who could trace its manifest content back to the latent content it concealed, could read the patient's unconscious with a clarity that no other method permitted. This is, in important ways, a secularized version of the Victorian Dream Dictionary. Freud also believed that dreams communicated in symbolic language, that the surface of the dream concealed a deeper meaning, and that the skilled interpreter could decode that meaning. What he changed was the source of the symbols. They were not universal, not fixed in a correspondence table, not the same for every dreamer. They were personal, idiosyncratic, generated by the specific history of the individual. To decode a dream required not a dictionary, but an analysis, a long, painstaking excavation of the individual's history, associations, and inner life. Freud was himself a product of the Victorian period, and his thinking bears the marks of the culture we have been exploring throughout this journey. His theory of hysteria drew directly on the same medical tradition that linked disturbed dreaming to disordered femininity. His concept of the unconscious had been prefigured by the Victorian mesmerists and their theory of the subliminal self. His understanding of the dream as a space in which normally suppressed content could appear in symbolic form echoed the Victorian understanding of the dream as a threshold where the hidden could become visible. But Freud changed the valence of these ideas in crucial ways. The Victorian subliminal self was understood largely as a positive faculty, a layer of mind with enhanced perception, greater creativity, access to the divine or the spiritual. Freud's unconscious was more ambivalent. It contained, yes, the creative and the spiritual, but also the primitive, the infantile, the sexual, the violent. The dream was not primarily a message from above. It was a communication from the parts of the self that polite Victorian consciousness preferred not to acknowledge. The reception of Freud in the English-speaking world was complex and sometimes hostile. His emphasis on sexuality as the primary driver of unconscious motivation offended many readers, who found in it a reductiveness that seemed to flatten the richness of dream experience into a single insistent theme. The Victorian dreamers who had recorded their nocturnal visions with such care, the prophetic dreams, the visitations from the dead, the symbolic communications of the night world, would not entirely have recognized themselves in Freud's account. And yet, something essential carried across. The Victorians had understood with great clarity that the dream was not nothing, that it spoke, that it knew things, that it came from somewhere beyond the ordinary waking self. Freud agreed. He disagreed about where beyond and about what the dream was saying, but the fundamental conviction that the night had its own wisdom, that the sleeping mind deserved the same serious, careful attention as the waking one. This conviction Freud inherited from the culture we have been exploring and transformed into the century that followed. The Victorian dream world was, in many ways, the last great moment of the pre-scientific imagination, engaging with the mystery of the night on its own terms, bringing to it the full resources of religious belief, folklore, scientific curiosity, literary imagination, and genuine emotional need. It was rich, contradictory, earnest, and sometimes extravagant. It was also, in its deepest impulse, simply human, the impulse to take seriously what happens in the dark, to attend to the images that rise unbidden from the depths of sleep, to believe that the night speaks and that we would do well to listen. And so we arrive here, at the end of this quiet journey through the Victorian night. The candle has burned low, the dream dictionary is closed, the mesmerist has gone home, and the seance room is empty. Somewhere in a locked cabinet in Vienna, a neurologist is writing by lamplight, beginning the book that will change everything. But that is tomorrow's world. Tonight still belongs to the Victorians, lying in their curtained beds, in the absolute dark, waiting to see what the night will bring. Sleep well. Whatever you dream tonight, the Victorians would have written it down.